My name is Mark Smith. My background, marine engineer, then a technical and fleet superintendent until coming to work at NorthStandard in the loss prevention department. Today, it's the 15th of April, and last week was quite a big week in the IMO circles. We'll go into more detail about that later, but we're quite happy about what's happened in some ways. I know some people won't be too happy about the trajectory of decarbonisation, but a lot of these webinars in the past we've been running for the past 3 or 4 years. We've been kicking the can down the road, and finally we seem to have some form of outcome. I'm going to go through that very slowly, and then Edwin is going to look into it in more detail on the fuel side of things, and then also the CII, and then Sarah's going to contract on the contractual side and looking into that and how that will take effect. So they will fill in all the gaps that I may leave in my part of the presentation and go into further detail. So some of you will be sick of seeing this slide, but I'm going to show you very quickly again, because what we're looking at now with the IMO as well as the Fuel EU is looking at the complete life cycle analysis. So this is taking everything into consideration, and that's what has been proposed by the IMO, but this is being developed at the GSAMP, which is the group of experts on the scientific aspects. So the life cycle analysis is going to it's going to be counted from start to finish, but it's in the process of development. And that's something Edwin may get the chance to talk about later on. So what was announced last week? What was the progress from last week and what came out of it? So first of all, ships over 5,000 gross tons, excluding domestic FPSOs, FSUs and drilling rigs. That may be further to change and as we go throughout the period of time, but at the moment, that is what has been announced. The majority approval has been given. However, formal adoption after an extraordinary session of the committee in October needs to take place. And if Edwin gets the time, he might talk a little bit more detail about that, about how the voting will take place, but that may be a potential barrier. This is not over and done with yet. We've still got to get through October, but the majority approval has been given, and then it's moving on to the formal adoption. But there are barriers in place there. It's a medium-term measure, and its anticipated entry into force is March 2027. The first monitoring period is January 2028. But the thing that we always want to say with these things is we often notice that some ship owners and managers and operators get ahead of the curve and they seem to fare better with things like this. One of the questions we got asked during the webinar was to do with pooling, not necessarily just on the IMO side of things, but potentially there may be pooling in the IMO and the medium-term measures as well. And is it too early to start pooling? And in our opinion, it's not, especially for the Fuel EU Maritime. We expect a peak as we come towards April 2026, and the IMO may be similar as we get towards that period. So planning is critical here, and looking as far forward as possible will be the most advantageous here. So we've also got a tightening greenhouse gas, that's GHG intensity, through to 2050. But what is going to cause delays here? What may cause delays? We've got a comprehensive review every 5 years, but then we've got a potential for delays. We've got geopolitical tensions across the world, and we've got some nations that may not be too happy with the proposed course of action. So it's far from over, but we're a little bit closer to where perhaps the globe needs to be in decarbonisation. So this is one of the schematics I would like to show you to try and simplify exactly what's going on here. So when we look at it here, we've got this green band here, which at the minute will potentially be things like B100 biofuels. So they're, very advantageous. They're an advantageous alternative fuel, and they will build up what's called a GFI compliance surplus unit, because they're better than the direct compliance and they're better than the base compliance. They're basically, obviously, a lower emission ratio for the GHG intensity. So GHG intensity per energy. So at the other end, we've got so this is the green ships here we're looking at. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we've obviously got the red ships, which we can see here are your traditional fossil fuels. and they will have to pay a fine on a compliance deficit basis of $380 per tonne till they get to this baseline here, and then it goes down to $100 per tonne. But it's important to note that you can only exchange between these two. So you can buy the surplus, you can basically pool the surplus units um, between this, and then yeah, that's a very good point, Lars. That's correct. There's a limitation on the amount of time you can keep the surplus units for, and that's 2 calendar years, which I think is within the rest of the presentation. But you're very correct in that, and that's one of the differences with the fuel EU. So basically, you can you can trade between these two, but you're not able to trade between the middle tier and everything else. Obviously, this is given the ability for ships which haven't had the chance to change to other alternative fuels to do so, and where infrastructure is not available, it's giving the equivalent of some form of trading, which may be something like pooling, but we're not too sure. And as with any of this, this is all subject to change, and we can't guarantee that what we're talking about now is something that is going to happen later on. So we just can't guarantee any of that. We're just saying what we've seen at the moment. So the next thing is then I'm just looking at how this works in a calculation. So I've done a real world calculation here, and that's assuming HFOs, which, VLSFOs fall very close to that category. So assuming the GFI for that is 91 grams CO2 E per megajoule. Then in 2028, the base target you will see there is 89.6, and the direct compliance is 77.4. So basically, what we're saying is we need, with a heavy fuel oil, we need to pay. Oh, sorry, I've gone on to the next slide there. What we need to pay is we need to pay this part of the fine here at 380 per ton CO2, and we also need to pay this part of the fine. At the bottom, we've got what's called a ZNZ reward. That's for things like B100 biofuels, and Sarah is going to talk about that later and what rewards are available for ships in that portion. But based on an energy density of 40 megajoules per kilogram, the direct compliance penalty for HFO, that's a ship burning 4,000 tons per year of HFO, which is quite realistic, and a base compliance penalty of $91,000. So that in total comes to $308,000 roughly, and that's a remedial unit of $308,000. So that effectively is a deficit that ship will make throughout the course of the year. And remember, that's in addition to the Fuel EU Maritime. So we haven't gone into deep calculations for biofuels, but I just wanted to show the difference with the biofuel. So we're looking here at a no penalty period and that's even for B24 biofuels. For those of you that aren't familiar, a B24 biofuel is one which is 24% biofuel, and then the other 76% is made up of other products effectively. So you can see here that up until from 2028, there is actually no penalty for B24. But then between 2028 and 2032, there's a gradual move here. So you will start building up effectively a deficit if you continue to use B24 biofuels between 2028 and 2032. And when you get past 2032, you're then going into the next level where you then not only have to pay your direct compliance, but you also have to pay your base as well. So that will be your 380 plus your 100. The reason why we've got the ZNZ reward on the bottom here is to show B100 biofuels, even right up until 2040, a B100 biofuel made with the correct sustainable credentials will effectively not impose any remedial units effectively. So then now we're going to look at roughly how this compares, how the trajectory compares to the Fuel EU Maritime. So you can see the green line here represents the Fuel EU Maritime, and the red line represents the IMO trajectory. So we can see it's actually a lot more of a sharper trajectory, and that also, these also carry on to 2050, but we're just showing you in the short term for visualization purposes. As we say, all of this is subject to change and not final by any stretch, but we just want to show you what we have learned recently. So we're comparing again the FuelEU. Whilst this webinar is not about FuelEU Maritime, we just want to give you a quick summary so you understand where they compare. So you can see on the FuelEU Maritime on the left-hand side here, a positive compliance balance can be borrowed, banked, pooled with other vessels or cancelled, and there's a penalty of $647 per tonne of excess CO2. On the IMO side, according to the midterm measures, surplus units can be banked for 2 years, and that has been put into the chat earlier, so it's a 2-year period. Can be traded with other ships not meeting the base GFI targets, pooled with other vessels, and as we said, there's nothing actually in the draft amendments to discuss pooling and indefinite, but from what we understand through rumblings throughout the industry and through accurate sources that we've got who have been contacted about this, we understand that pooling will take place on this side of the business. And then we've got a fine here, which we've discussed, but it's not a fine, sorry, it's a penalty, a redemption unit, and that is 380 and 100 as we discussed on the previous slides. Just here, what I want to do, these are some data that was given to us by BetterSea, and what this is looking at is how fuel costs stack up, over the next period, and basically looking at it very roughly, HFO or VLSFO around that is going to, in 2028, it'll cost very approximately $800 per ton. That will rise to approximately 968 USD per ton in 2030, and will go up to 1,512 USD in 2035. So we can see from that there's a definite reason to shift over. And as far as the IMO goes, and LNG is still a transitional alternative fuel, but as far as the IMO goes, biofuels look to be in favor, as one of the fuels which is, going to work quite well. And you can see that by these charts effectively. I'm not going to go through these charts in detail. I'm going to leave them there and they'll get passed with a follow-up package, but please feel free to have a look at them. And then thank you very much, Katie. Katie's just put a link into the chat there that shows you that, as a NorthStandard member, you have a huge benefit available with the BetterSea's platform for the FuelEU side of things, because there is no transaction fees involved effectively when you're a NorthStandard member. On a container ship, that can save up to $40,000 or euros roughly per container ship, and that is just from being a NorthStandard member. So Katie has just kindly put that into the chat there. And then very quickly before I go, just to give you a visualization of what we're talking about here, we were talking about that one vessel using heavy fuel oil before. That's the vessel we're basically looking at here. And that has got remedial units totaling 308,000 from 1 year. Whereas you may have another vessel burning, for example, B100 biofuels, and that will build up a surplus as well. So effectively you have a surplus on one side of the equation, and you'll have a remedial unit on the other, or reward unit as they're sometimes referred to, and that will then allow some financial exchange between the two companies. That can be done between yourselves, or there's various platforms out there such as BetterSea's which help you to do that by anonymously allowing an exchange of these units for the FuelEU Maritime, for example, like I say, but it's something they may look to doing on the IMO side of things as well. So that means you can use the platform to agree with another party on an anonymous basis. Once you agree that, then the contracts will be set up in the escrow accounts, and then you will find out who the other party is. But we've run a webinar on that. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I don't want to, come too much off track at the moment. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Edwin, and I'm going to have a look at some of the questions that come in. So thank you very much, everybody, for your time. And over to you now, Edwin, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to talk about fuel certification, which is a relevant part of this new suite of regulations that we've approved at the IMO. We haven't adopted them. So these new regulations are on a well-to-wake basis. Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Edwin. I'm chair of the Royal Institution of Naval Architects IMO committee. I spent the last 2 weeks at MEPC doing a whole bunch of different things. With my other hat on, I do a lot of consulting on GHG regulatory matters. So back to this. Fuel certification. If we have no fuel certification, the IMO cannot recognize fuels for the GFI. And so then this thing doesn't really work. So while everyone has been discussing all the major issues around how the GFI text should look like, there's been a bunch of people and countries working away on fuel certification. And so the main things we need to know are that the IMO is not creating a new fuel certification scheme from scratch because there is no time. We're starting, probably the first year of the GFI will be 2028, and there is really not enough time to do lots of different things. There's about 20 odd guidelines that need to be written. What instead the IMO is doing is we will set some minimum criteria and requirements to recognize existing regional, national, or other certification schemes to be used within the framework. So things like you're already familiar with, so the EU RED, so the certificates, so the proof of sustainability you get from ISCC or RSB or others. The idea is that the IMO system will have some requirements to recognize these EU schemes and other regional schemes that you might find around the world so that you can buy fuels anywhere in the world and be confident that these fuels have been, the supply chain of these fuels has been audited and checked, and that the fuels you get with the GHG value that's stated is in accordance with the IMO LCA guidelines and in accordance with all the other IMO provisions. So these criteria broadly will cover, as I said, minimum governance and audit requirements, and in particular, the specific way in which the IMO LCA guidelines calculate the GHG well-to-wake intensity. There's also some sustainability criteria in the LCA guidelines, which are important. These will also be applied or have to be applied to the fuel. So these sustainability criteria are still being further developed. However, you may find, and I see some questions about, well, when will any particular fuel be compliant until? The answer is that it's not fully clear because a lot of it depends on what we actually agree in terms of how the fuels are assessed and what GHG value they come up with. So a biofuel today may meet the criteria, and some biofuel may not. We don't know yet because the LCA guidelines and a lot of the detail around these sustainability criteria are still being developed. So we don't really know. Some biofuel will be eligible and some may not. And probably the most important bit after that is that when you bunker your fuel, the regulatory text now has a provision where this certified information about the well-to-wake intensity and all the various categories you see in these little boxes to the right, all of these will accompany or should accompany your BDN. So meaning when you bunker, you receive, at the end of bunkering, you receive your BDN, you should receive also all the certified information, either at the same time or up to potentially a few days or a few weeks later. Then that allows you to then pass that information up the chain for further verification with your class society, with your recognized organization, sorry. And all this information is important because that goes into this new thing called the IMO GFI registry. And this is one of the areas of difference between the IMO system and FuelEU. FuelEU, you have this pooling system where you have a verifier that sits on top of your pool, and you have to nominate your pool with you. And when you get your compliance balance, the IMO is slightly different. There's a centralized registry for all of this information, and that also records all the individual transfers of your compliance surplus between companies. So the main thing you need to know, fuel certification is on the way, and this will, when it's all up and running, hopefully by next year, you will then soon be able to then buy fuels according to this system, and then they will be eligible for the IMO. I'm going to pass this to Sarah.
Thanks, Edwin. So just by way of introduction, my name's Sarah McCann and I'm a senior solicitor in the External Affairs Department at NorthStandard. I'm also part of the club's decarbonisation expertise team. And as Mark said, over the next few slides, I'm going to speak to the contractual side in respect of the IMO midterm measures. So firstly, I wanted to talk about responsibility for compliance with the midterm measures, should they be adopted and then come into force. So under MARPL, compliance will be with the vessel itself, and under the approved draft regulations, the company responsible for compliance is defined as the owner of the ship or any other organisation or person, such as the manager or the bareboat charterer, who has assumed responsibility for the operation of the ship from the owner, and who, on assuming such a responsibility, has agreed to take over all the duties and responsibilities imposed by the ISM code. So responsibility, so the entity responsible would seemingly therefore be the ISM company, or in other words, the document of compliance holder. So that could therefore be the registered owner, a bareboat charterer, or a third-party ship manager. So if the amendments to MARPL Annex 6 are adopted in October of this year, then, as Mark has said, they are set to come into force in 2027 and then take effect from the 1st of January 2028. So whilst we'll have to wait to see what happens and what any guidance notes which follow may say, should these midterm measures be adopted, then obviously ship owners, charterers and ship managers will need to think about the contractual implications of this. So this is going to mean considering those long-term charter parties, ship management agreements and also bunker supply contracts, those which have already been entered into and which will run into and beyond 2028, alongside new contracts which are going to be being entered into and will also extend into 2028 and beyond. So the draft approved regulations do set out some monitoring, reporting and verification requirements. So firstly, in respect of the Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan, by the 1st of January 2028, the SEMP will need to be verified to include both a description of the methodology that's going to be used to collect the data required to calculate the vessel's annual GFI, as well as the processes that will be used to report that data to the vessel's administration authority. As Edwin said, a central IMO GFI registry is also set to be established, and vessels will be required to register for an account in the GFI registry by the 1st of October 2027. The regulations also set out a timeline for reporting of data, and that's going to culminate in the issue of a statement of compliance for the vessel, and that statement of compliance would be valid for a year. So thinking a little bit more about that timeline for reporting and verification, you'll see on the slide there a list of key dates which are set out in those draft approved amendments to MARPL Annex 6. So following the end of a reporting period, so this will be from the 1st of January 2029 onwards, if the midterm measures are to come into effect, then this timeline will need to be followed in terms of that reporting and verification. So by the 31st of March, a vessel will need to report to its administration authority or an organisation which has been authorised to do so, the attained annual GFI, the target annual GFI, and also the GFI compliance balance. And that'll be for the preceding reporting period and will also need to include any supporting data. Then by the 30th of June, the administration authority or another organisation which has been authorised to do so is to verify that reported data, and that reported data is to be also reported to the IMO GFI registry. Then within a month of that, so by the end of July latest, the vessel is to determine in the GFI registry its selected GFI compliance approaches, so how it's going to comply and the payment of remedial units, etc. Then by the end of August, the GFI registry is to issue a ship account statement. Following that, the administration or another organisation which has been authorised to do so is to issue a statement of compliance related to the annual GFI for the vessel, and that's to be by the end of September. And then by the end of October, that statement of compliance is to be reported to the GFI registry vessel account. As I say, that the issued statement of compliance will be valid for a year and is to be kept on board. So should these draft midterm measures be adopted and come into effect, then, as I mentioned earlier, there'll be a number of things which will need to be considered from the contractual side in respect of compliance with the IMO net zero framework. So firstly, there's the greenhouse gas energy intensity of the fuel that's being supplied to the vessel. Where it is the charterers who will be supplying fuel to the vessel, then owners may want to ensure that the relevant clause or clauses in a charter party provide an obligation on the charterers to ensure that the fuel that's being supplied to the vessel will not lead to the vessel exceeding its GFI limit. So in the context of a time charter, provision will need to be made as to which fuels are to be provided to the vessel. So that's going to include obviously a fuel specification and also consideration as to which fuels can be safely used on board. And as is always the case, the parties will need to agree on that fuel specification and also the testing and liability regime. And this needs to be clearly set out, obviously, within the terms of a charter party. Also, in the context of a time charter, there'll also need to be consideration in respect of how any fuel burned during a period of off-hire would be dealt with. Moving on to think a bit more about the kind of documentation and data side and kind of expanding on what Edwin said earlier. Obviously from an owner's or ship manager's perspective, provision is going to need to be included in a charter party relating to the ability to obtain any required information and data from a charterer who is supplying fuel to the vessel. So this data will need to be provided obviously in a timely manner, and that information and data will also need to be accurate and compliant with the regulations. So this will include the fuel certification, which Edwin spoke about, and also what information needs to be included within or alongside a bunker delivery note. So therefore, it's going to be important to think about those bunker supply contracts as well, particularly for those parties who are responsible for the purchasing of fuel, in order to ensure that all of the information and documentation is going to be obtained from the bunker suppliers. As Edwin said, this is going to need to be passed on to evidence the fuel which has been stemmed in order that the correct greenhouse gas energy intensity can be calculated. From an owner's perspective, obviously, an owners will no doubt be wanting to pass on any costs of compliance with the net zero framework down the charter party chain. So that would include, obviously, the cost of the purchase of remedial units. So in the context of a time charter, you'll need to have, obviously, clear provision in respect of responsibility for the cost of those tier 1 and tier 2 remedial units, and also any associated administrative costs. Obviously, as compliance will not need to be finalised until end of July, following a reporting period, you'll also need to think about situations where charterers are only going to have the vessel on charter for part of a reporting period, or where a charter party is going to span more than one reporting period, and how that's going to be dealt with contractually. So in that situation, the parties may prefer to estimate or calculate an apportionment for the cost of compliance on a more regular basis, for example, on a monthly or a per voyage basis. In respect of a voyage charter, the cost of compliance with the IMO net zero framework may need to be allocated through, for example, an increased freight rate, which will take into account the additional fuel costs, or alternatively be recovered by way of a surcharge. Thought will also need to be had as to what will happen with any surplus units. For example, are these going to be banked for a future reporting period, or are they going to be sold to another vessel or vessels? And if so, how will that interplay with a charterer's obligations under the charter party? Where it is the charterers providing fuel to the vessel, Obviously, the parties will also need to consider whether the charterers will get the full benefit of any surplus units if they are to be banked or sold, or would they receive any monetary reimbursement? And if so, how will this work where the charter party doesn't cover a full reporting period? So, for example, will the charters receive any benefit or incentive where surplus units are being banked, but then they won't be the charterers of the vessel for that subsequent reporting period? And also, the parties will need to consider how any reward for zero and near zero greenhouse gas fuels, technologies, and energy sources is to be apportioned. So in respect of Z and Z rewards, the methodology to determine those rewards and what they will be is going to be developed by the IMO in guidelines, which will follow. This is to be determined by no later than the 1st of March 2027, and then that will be reviewed every 5 years thereafter. So just moving on now, we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about what came out of MEPC 83 in respect of the IMO's short-term greenhouse gas reduction measures. And with regard to CII, Edwin's going to go into more detail as to what was discussed and agreed at MEPC 83. And in particular, Edwin's going to talk about the reduction levels which have been set for 2027 onwards. But from the contractual side, I just wanted to briefly point out that in respect of CII, going forward, it will obviously start to become increasingly harder to achieve the reduction levels which have been set. So accordingly, if owners are wanting to make operational changes to meet the greater reduction factors, then they're going to need to try and engage charterers if they've not already done so. And obviously this will need to be done through ensuring contractual provisions are agreed between the parties. So I just wanted to re-emphasize that. But I'll hand now back over to Edwin, who's going to talk us through what was agreed in respect of CII.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so everyone's attention was focused on these new midterm measures. There were also discussions on the review of the short-term measure, i.e. the CII. And as some of you may know, we had to define the reduction rates for 27 to 2030. We managed to do this, and the values that are on screen here. So it's a 2.625% increment every year until we get to 2030, where the total reduction rate relative to 2019 will be 21.5%. The review of CII has not been completed. We've completed what was called phase 1, and we have agreed at the IMO that the review needs to continue because we haven't solved or fixed CII. Probably many of you are aware of some of the challenges that there are. But more time is needed to find the right solutions and test them and analyze them, and then for them to enter into force. So I'll talk about the work plan for the ongoing review of CII, but before that, there were a few other things were agreed. One was that anonymized DCS data will be made available to public user accounts on the IMO system. We're not exactly sure when this will take effect. It will be after 2027, but this will then allow anyone with a public user account to download all of the previous year's DCS data, but in an anonymized format. So ships are not identified individually, and the deadweights and gross tonnage are rounded. And then companies may then also request to see their non-anonymized data, meaning if you own a ship or you're in control of a ship, you may request to see what data has been uploaded to the IMO DCS. There have been some issues where the data that you have sent to the recognized organization or the administration sometimes for whatever reason, has ended up not being exactly the same as what has been passed on to the DCS. This also then allows you to check for further errors if you so desire. So the work plan. So the work plan for this further review of the CII has been agreed, and the review needs to be finalized in 2028. Broadly, there are some priorities. So in spring 2026, MEPC 84 meets, where we will further consider and finalize the development of an enhanced SEMP framework. So one of the proposals to review or change the CII is to move it more towards an ISM style audit review and audit mechanism, and applying that to the SEMP framework. So currently, although the SEMP framework has a requirement for an annual company audit, the terms and the provisions and the processes are not very clearly defined. So one option is to try and tighten some of that up and actually move a little bit more of the compliance away from meeting a CII requirement and more on meeting actions carried out according to the SEMP plan. So if you've carried out all of the measures that you have planned in the SEMP, but you don't quite get to the required CII, the audit will consider that as acceptable. That's the one possible direction of travel, and that's why this is being prioritized as the first thing. The second issue for those of you who operate cruise ships is to finalize the development of the cruise ship metric. And then there's some work to consider how the CII will combine or complement and avoid perhaps overlap with the midterm measures we've just agreed, so the the greenhouse gas fuel standard. As some of you may be aware, the CII is currently tank to wake, sort of tank to wake, because we do accept biofuels. However, the GFI is well to wake. And then in MEPC 85, we will then also further consider the development of other CII metrics. So I note one of the comments in terms of correction factors. The correction factor approach has been generally not agreed on. So the direction of travel is to minimize or avoid adding further correction factors, but actually to have a wholesale change of metric of the CII. And one of the potential options is for the CII metric to move from being total fuel consumption to be only sea passage fuel consumption from propulsion. So leaving aside all of the emissions and the fuel consumption in port and maneuvering, etc., and also excluding all generator and boiler fuel consumption, so that it's just propulsion fuel consumption over distance. So that's a potential way to go. And in fact, what we have done is, in order to prepare for such a possibility, we have made some definition changes within the SEMP guidelines, which will then apply from next year. So some of you may be aware, from next year, the reporting to the DCS is going to change. You will have to start reporting your fuel consumption by fuel consumer type. So fuel consumption from main engines, fuel consumption will be separate from fuel consumption from the generators, will be separate from fuel consumption from the boilers. And you also have to report your fuel consumption per consumer type when the vessel is not underway. And so in order to then clarify what not underway means, this definition has been added to the SEMP guidelines, and it is aligned with the definition in the IMO FAL convention under the definitions for setting up a maritime single window, which is then now an agreed set of standard information that could be transmitted electronically. So what it's going to be is underway is then defined as the period between full head-on passage, otherwise known as start of sea passage, and the end of sea passage. Not underway is therefore all the period between the end of the sea passage and full head-on passage, or end of sea passage and start of sea passage. So everything between end of sea passage, including all the maneuvering to at berth and back off again until you start sea passage, that becomes not underway. We've agreed that for canal passages will also be part of not underway. So that is the end of my slide. So I'll pass this back to Mark, and then we can probably start discussing all the questions.
Thank you, Edwin. Thank you, Sarah. I think the only thing I'm just going to show quickly as requested. Sorry, I'm just going to take control. I'm just going to show the slides that were requested. Well, perhaps before I do that, though, Edwin, I think there's a couple of questions just come in that you may wish to answer just while you're on topic and while you've got the microphone in your hand, so to speak. They're in the chat. So there's one of them I commented on additional.
Oh yes.
Correction.
Okay,
factors.
so starting with correction factors. So I dealt briefly with correction factors, but the IMO will not be considering as a priority any further correction factors. As I explained earlier, the focus is then actually on a metric change, which actually then removes nearly all of the requirements for additional correction factors. It's a lot of the correction factors you ask for, you speak about in your message, staying in port, waiting time. If there is no longer any, if the CII no longer includes all the time that where the vessel is not on sea passage, then this issue of waiting time actually goes away. And if you no longer include any consumption from generators or boilers, then actually your anything to do with waiting or at anchorage or whatever no longer becomes an issue. So then it's purely your fuel consumption of the main engines when you're on sea passage. With regards to short voyage, actually the analysis that has been done is that because it's sea passage, it also removes nearly all of the influence of short voyages, because it partly depends on when you start your recording or what you define as the start of sea passage, but generally it's when you're already free of maneuvering and acceleration is almost done, so and the engine is already at constant revs. So the penalty or the influence of short voyages, which is about a lot of stops, a lot of acceleration, a lot of maneuvering, that's all taken out. So therefore, the view is that it's unlikely that we would need correction factors if the metric changes in this way. Of course, if after we look at this metric and we find there's still a need to make some adjustment, then that could be further considered. But bearing in mind what I said earlier about the SEMP framework, where we're trying to look more at what the ships have implemented rather than what number they've reached, this then provides you with some flexibility. Because the idea is actually the ship will then now be compared to itself, its previous year's performance, rather than the average line of the CII reduction, required CII. And then the other one on CII is, yes, so this issue on the IMO's view on challenges and gaps. As I said, this change of the metric is actually designed to move more towards the realities, i.e. sea passage, and many of the challenges and gaps actually are solved by going down this route. And that was the aim, rather than implementing lots of small little correction factors for very specific use cases. The interest was to move to something that had more global application and to slowly align this with how the industry, in particular, does performance monitoring. And then finally, there was a question, I think, about diesel electric. So for diesel electric vessels, judging this is probably an LNG carrier question, then this is still to be determined. There will probably need to be some guidelines on how this is done. But generally on a diesel electric vessel, you have in your propulsion motors, you will have kilowatts hour, meter, counter, etc. So you can log the difference between what's for propulsion and what's not for propulsion. What you then need to do is then divide or apportion your fuel consumption for the year based on that split of kilowatt hours. That's likely what's going to happen. It's not exact, it's approximate because the SFOC of your engines vary, but on a diesel electric vessel, you generally try to optimize your SFOC and the running of your generators. So that's likely to be how the reporting for that will work. I think that's all on the CII for now.
Thank you. That's excellent. I mean, the only other thing is talking about status of penalties, but from what I gather, the corrective action plan is in place, but we're not aware of any, ports applying penalties, obviously there's the risk of, detentions, inspections, etc., etc. But are you aware? I know there was a working group set up to look at this some time back, Edwin, but has there been any progress there? Do you know? I'd imagine it's a very slow-moving topic, but.
Yes. Current status of penalties with regard to consecutive CO2 battery. Sorry, I missed that. Yes, so there is still no discussion of enforcement apart from the SEMP approach, which is just based on auditing and internal reviews. And so if you, for now, if you are E-rated and you produce a plan of corrective actions, and if in a year's time or 2 years' time you're still E-rated, you continue to produce a new plan of corrective actions. Some flag states or some administrations may ask questions, some may not. However, there is no provision currently within the regulatory text to have any stronger sanction than requiring a plan of corrective actions. So the requirement then under port state control would be you need to have a statement of compliance, which is dependent on you having a plan of corrective actions if you're E-rated or D-rated for 3 years. And as long as you have the documentation, there is no other sanction that can be applied.
Thank you. That's excellent. Thank you very much, Edwin. I think there's one on the BIMCO clause there from George. Sarah, would you be able to have a look at that one, please? I think there's been a partial response to it, but have you got anything to add to that, please?
Yeah, thanks for that one. Yeah, so it's certainly kind of the case that we've also seen from the kind of the club side that in respect of the BIMCO CAI operations clause for time charter parties that yeah, there's obviously resistance there from a lot of charterers for including in that clause, certainly as drafted. What we're often seeing is kind of more watered down kind of agreements to cooperate sort of clauses, which obviously provide owners with a lot less protection. So I think, yes, I would agree with kind of the comments that have been made there in the chat about that. And obviously just reiterate though how obviously important it is, particularly from the owner's side, to engage charterers and to have those discussions in respect of the clause, and the BIMCO clause obviously being a good starting point, certainly, and trying to agree the most robust terms possible in terms of, certainly from an owner's perspective, for that collaboration and sharing of information, particularly where there's going to be operational changes going to be needed to be made. And obviously just reiterating again that obviously as a club we're here to assist as well, so please do reach out to obviously your usual FD&D claims handler who be able to help with that, or obviously as well the decarbonisation expertise team. The email address was on one of the slides, so it should be there, and we can put it in the chat as well. So please do reach out if there's anything obviously you want us to help with in terms of those contractual negotiations.
Just while we've got your attention there, Sarah, there's another one coming from René Delnad talking about the BIMCO clause for the new medium-term measures. And I know you're going to be sitting on the BIMCO drafting committee. I'm not too sure if it's that one, so I won't say too much more. But yeah, I'd look forward to hearing from you on that.
So just in respect of, yeah, I mean, obviously these midterm measures have obviously they've not yet been adopted and obviously come into force. So I'm not aware as yet that there's been any kind of, there's going to be a BIMCO clause kind of committee set up yet, but I imagine that will be something if they do get adopted and obviously come into force, that obviously that it would be helpful to have an industry-wide clause. So I imagine that is something that the attention would be turned to in due course.
Thank you. Thanks. There's a message in from Joanna Meadows. We'll probably discuss that offline, Joanna. It's a bit political, so I don't think I'll raise that one during this webinar, if it's okay. I don't think we've got any more questions in the chat there or in the Q&A. I was asked as one of the questions to share the slides on the fuel calculations again. So I mean, these are going to be sent in a follow-up package as well. So so we're going to send these through in a follow-up package. These aren't my calculations. The earlier calculations were my calculations. As I've said, these are basically calculations by BetterC, and they've used, you know, their platform and their various research techniques to come up with these figures. So I can't guarantee them. All I can say is that BetterC are quite, you know, sophisticated in this area. Let's say they've got quite a bit of knowledge, and also I know that when they posted these, various other parties have commented on them and said that they're really interesting. So so at the moment they may be quite useful. This is obviously the 2028. If we're looking at HFO, we're looking at, you know, you can see here that there's a fuel EU penalty, an EU ETS cost, and then you've got the IMO costs on top of that. And then if we go for the same period, you can see the heightening costs for the IMO. It doesn't quite come into force in 2030, but then when we go into 2035, you're talking about a massive uplift on the price of heavy fuel oil. So obviously, as we know, biofuels and biodiesels have been coming up in price quite a bit lately. And then, but obviously this may put them in favour. And I think from what I've seen in the last few days, there's been quite a push towards biofuels with this IMO midterm measures, but we'll see how that goes, because obviously there's a certain amount of demand there. Is there another?
Sorry, Mark, just to say, the values for HFO and LFO and MGO look a little bit like the fuel EU values, but the IMO values are not exactly the same. And actually, high sulfur HFO and VLSFO have different GHG intensity values. So just a point of note that your compliance position is actually affected by whether you use a scrubber or you don't.
Yes, that's a good point, isn't it? Yeah, because for the VLSFO, is it 3.114? Is that ringing a bell or not?
No, it's the 91.74.
The GHG intensity, not the actual
CO2
emission factor.
The
GHG. Yes, I've got yes.
Yeah. So high sulfur HFO is slightly better than VLSFO because of the additional process that's required for desulfurization.
Ah, right. Okay. So what roughly is the very low sulfur fuel oil GHG intensity? Again, I might have looked at it once. I think in fact, yeah. Okay. Anyway, we'll worry about that later on here. But yeah.
Yeah, but there is a difference. I think it's about 95 for for VLSFO and 92 point something for.
Quite a big difference, isn't it?
Yeah. HSF. Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Okay. Is there something else coming to the chat? Sorry, just while I'm talking away there.
Did we answer the fuel EU and IMO overlap? I think that was a Q&A.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, I think both I did, and then Sarah did as well. So, and I think basically said it's a moving space. You know what I mean? So, and let's see what happens. You know, but yeah, I'd imagine they're going to take it into consideration. You know, and let's see how it goes. Any idea when the IMO LCV values will be released for the fuel types? I think Edwin might be the.
They already released the 2024 IMO LCA guidelines are released as, let me give you the resolution number, as MEPC resolution 391, and so the values for the at least the fossil fuels are already there. However, the default values for other fuel types are still being developed. And of course, it will vary depending on feedstock.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Okay, I think we've answered all the questions. I said, like I said to everybody, we're targeting to get this follow-up package out to everybody who registered within a month, and then the video will go live on YouTube as well. You know, first and foremost, I just want to say, you know, thank you to everybody from the digital team who contributed towards making this happen. You know, there's a lot of work goes into the background to make it happen. Thank you to Edwin and Sarah for your contribution to this. You know, really appreciate it, and you've answered some good questions and some good questions that came in, and really that's what we want. We want to try and provide our members with some, you know, pertinent information on this. And thank you to all the audience more than anything. I can see a lot of faces coming back to these webinars time after time. So that's really good. It's really nice to see, and we get some great questions during this, which helps us to learn. You know, I can honestly put my hand up and say that I've had to do quite a bit of cramming since Friday to try and get this all in. Hopefully we've tried and made it easier for everybody else to understand, but I'm sure you will have further questions as we go throughout, and please feel free to reach out to us. I'm just going to put our contact details on the screen again, but yet again that will come through with the follow-up package. Okay, with that, I'm going to say thank you and goodbye, and I'm going to allow Edwin and Sarah to extend their gratitude as well. Wishing you all a pleasant week ahead, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Take care, everybody. Bye.